and welcome. All right, welcome. We are, I know a couple more people are going to join us, but I want to thank everybody for being here. We're going to be working on our new lecture series here, or our continuing lecture series beginning here in the fall 2021, Race and Power. And today I'll be talking about language and power and lessons from linguistic anthropology. My name is Dr. Dylan Mahoney, and thanks for being here. We're also going to be recording this, and we're recording this in a couple of different ways. We're actually testing some of what we can do with some of the equipment in our new media lab, and I apologize if some of the slides are a little bit washed out, but this is all something that we're experimenting with, but what I'm going to be talking about, I think, is the most important part. Before we get much further, I do want to just begin with our department land acknowledgement. Basically acknowledging that the University of South Florida and our department is a product of the privilege that we have of being on land. The land here in Florida was traditionally occupied, and the property of the, I apologize that this isn't completely clear, of the Seminole, the Calusa, though, and the Tacubega. There are many groups, indigenous peoples, that live in Florida today. And I think most importantly from this statement is the part that states that as a department, we recognize the historical and the continuing impacts of colonization on the indigenous communities, and that we work to help indigenous communities and recognize their sovereignty here in Florida and elsewhere. And I hope that I can speak back to this acknowledgement as much in this talk as I can, talking about linguistic anthropology. Obviously, the acknowledgement itself is language. All right, so let's talk about language. When I was preparing for this, my theme became, all of these challenges because of the things I'm trying to do here. So a couple things I'm actually trying to accomplish, and I apologize if this is a little bit washed out. It's basically the same kind of things I'm saying here, but I do want to connect back, right? Doing a talk on race, language, and power, I want to connect directly back to the main themes of our series and for our Committee of Diversity and Inclusion. I also want to deal with another issue which is interesting in our department, which is how do you apply linguistic anthropology? Of the subfields, it's one of the primary subfields in our department that everyone, I think, says that, well, what we do is mediated by language and we're all working with language. So we're all kind of, doing some linguistic anthropology, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of room for discussion of what theory comes out of linguistic anthropology, what we can learn from some of the basic fundamentals of linguistic anthropology that we often don't get back to. And so this isn't designed to be a discussion of my specific research, but really just some of the basics for faculty who are looking for ways to teach this, or for graduate students or for undergraduates who may be watching this and are interested in what they can learn today from some of the fundamentals of linguistic anthropology, and of course, how this is useful. So I'm going to try to conclude by at least showing how this is somewhat useful to all of you. Now, there are some overlaps. So for those of you who may be thinking, linguistic anthropology, what exactly is that? It overlaps quite a bit theoretically with other subfields or subfields that you may be familiar with. Things like anthropology of media and visual anthropology is heavily influenced by theory from linguistic anthropology. And you may think visual anthropology, isn't that about what you see? And isn't linguistic anthropology about what you say? And actually, that's an interesting question, because what brings them all together is that we're really talking about communication, and anthropology of communication. And that communication can take place in lots of different ways. And so one of the fundamental things from linguistic anthropology, and I'll mention this in a moment when I define language, is that we define language very broadly. And so there are lots of different types of symbolic systems that we can talk about that are linguistic, even if it's not spoken. Okay. Now, performance and performance analysis often comes out of linguistic anthropology. A lot of ethnomusicology, studies of language and power relating to policy are also often rooted in linguistic anthropology. And you can study, for example, the history of language and language policy in the US, which speaks directly to a lot of the issues of race and power that we could talk about today. And I'll mention a couple of those things as I go through my talk here. Of course, in the US, it's important to realize that one of the few things the founding fathers agreed on was that we would have no official language in the United States. And so the United States is one of these countries that does not have an official language. And yet the politics of language are very powerful today in the United States as much as ever. All right, so let's run through some fundamentals. All right, some sort of basic issues around linguistic anthropology. So yes, I found a way to get Boaz and Malinowski into the talk today, and I'm sorry, by doing this remotely, I don't have to hear the groans. But my reminder here, the only thing I wanted to say about Boaz and Malinowski is that they both stressed language. They both studied language and were themselves, in a sense, linguists. Boaz had studied in the German linguistic school before coming to the United States. He had a lot of interest in, for example, the cross-cultural color of water. And many of the ideas that we think about with cultural relativity were developed alongside linguistic relativity, which we don't actually hear as much about. With cultural relativity, we will often hear, oh, it's the opposite of ethnocentrism. What exactly is linguistic relativity? So linguistic relativity comes out of a time period where, very much like cultural relativity, there was a lot of ethnocentric thought having to do with language. So you had savage or degenerate languages, and then you had the idea of a pure or a better language. And so much of what people like Boaz and Malinowski were saying is that idea of ranking languages as being better or worse is fundamentally problematic. However, going beyond that, the other part of linguistic relativity that's really important and that has an ongoing impact on fields even outside of linguistic anthropology is the idea that, according to linguistic relativity, language is really a product of the complexity of the human brain. And as an anti-racist idea and a universalist idea, if we are all the same biologically and our brains are of the same capacity and complexity, if different, then therefore all of human language should be equally complex. And so, in other words, you can look at a language, and this happened in the 1960s. There were some studies done by linguists in the 1960s of what they called Black English, which would later be called African American English or African American Vernacular English or Ebonics beginning in 1973. And they studied these things in the 1960s and said, oh, this is a degenerate language. This is not a language that has the grammatical complexity of English. And in fact, it would be later in the 60s and 70s, people like William Labov and others would study this and say, well, in fact, okay, there are areas where this dialect of English has some simplifications, but there are other areas where it's actually much more complex. And so this is a standard thing you can do when you compare languages. You can find a language, for example, that has no morpheme for pluralization, but it does other things, right? So languages are complex in different areas. There are languages that have 8 noun classes, 18 noun classes. In English, we have 1. However, our verbal system in English is incredibly complicated, whereas you have other languages with lots of noun classes, and yet they have much more simple verbal systems. And so this idea, again, of linguistic relativity is that languages are equally complex. They are a product of the human mind. Okay, now the other thing that's important in this is, I would say, and as a cultural anthropologist, I'm always hesitant to use the word natural. But what makes this such a cool thing, studying language, is that it's very clearly biological and cultural. We're clearly born with the capacity for language. Okay, language is something that we think we teach our kids, and yet it's kind of like walking, right? We think we help our kids and we teach our kids how to walk, but we really don't have to. They're born with the ability to walk. They're gonna stand up, and it's not like our kids end up crawling if we don't teach them to walk. And the same thing happens with language. We think we're teaching our children how to speak until we hear what they say, and then we think, I didn't teach them that, right? And the reality is, you can put any child in a linguistic environment and they will develop language. So clearly there's a nice mixture here, okay? And so, going a little further with this, you might say, are we all multilingual? I often have students who say, well, I only speak English. And the reality is, even if you only speak English, there are a lot of different Englishes, okay? So we define language in linguistic anthropology rather open, right? There are lots of different types of language. And I would tell a student who says, I only know one language, you know how to use that language, though, in a lot of different ways. You can probably code switch between different dialects, and you have capacities, because again, your linguistic capacity is a product of your brain. I know people who speak 10 languages, but can they actually use those languages in 10 different ways? Can they get into the deep idiomatic understandings of those languages, right? Sometimes you can, but it's a way of saying, look, we're all actually multilingual. The other part of this is that not all language is spoken. And I'm gonna give you here a definition of language. A language is any symbolic system for which we can develop a literacy. And then you might say, huh? And then what's a literacy? And a literacy, I can say, is any symbolic system for which we can develop a good understanding. And then you might say, huh? Now, I'm not going to go through all of the old discussions of signs and the 3 types of signs, but this actually comes from semiotics. There are 3 major types of signs: the icon, the index, and the symbol. Not going to confuse anybody with that. But the key here is that the icon and the symbol are different. An icon is like a picture of a guitar on a sign. Anybody can look at that and they see a picture of a guitar. It's an icon for a guitar. You don't have to speak English. You know that that represents a guitar. It's an icon. In language, we call this onomatopoeia. So any language that stands for exactly what it represents: boom, bang, roof. Okay. Now, at the same time, most language, however, is symbolic. And what that means is that symbolic is not iconic. Symbolic means the meaning of the word or the sound or the symbol is arbitrary. You have to learn it. This is not something we're born with. So there are some iconic things that all humans can understand, but at the same time, we need to learn language. It is symbolic. And that's why the big important thing with all of this is language, right, is not iconic. Language is symbolic. It is learned, like culture. It's something that we have to learn. It is knowledge that we learn that we then use to interpret others' behavior and to shape our own behavior. All right. And similarly, right, when we learn language, we're learning these symbolic systems. However, there are lots of symbolic systems. In other words, there are lots of languages besides just the stuff that comes out of our mouth. And sign language is something that you can study in great detail as a linguistic anthropologist, because sign language, despite past research saying that sign language is some kind of degenerate language, it's only iconic, it's pantomimes, right? Sign language is not just pantomimes. It's heavily symbolic. You have to learn it. There are many different sign languages, okay, because the symbolics are all very different and they, were developed over time in different places. And so as a result, okay, language is symbolic. What this means is language is not really mouth stuff, it's brain stuff. Humans can be born without the ability to hear, which isn't all that uncommon. And yet, because language is a product of our brains, we can still come up with other symbolic systems to develop our brains and to come up with these amazing ways of communicating, all right, which are learned, and yet they're things that we're born with. So it's really kind of exciting. Okay, so to go a little bit further, I wanted to show one of the few people you will often hear about. And some people, when I say, what do you know about linguistic anthropology? They'll say, Sapir-Whorf. Okay, so a couple of things. Main point with Sapir, okay, he was a student of Boas's. And I talked about Boas, mentioned him briefly before. But many of Boas's students were focused on language, and many of them went around North America recording Native American indigenous languages. And that focus on language, you can tell in many ways, was sort of pushed by Boas. And Boas also allowed his students to do things linguistically and to analyze language during their research in a way that was rather innovative. And so the other person you hear a lot about is Zora Neale Hurston, who was a student of Boas's, and who was very interested in language. She studied the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, but was also very interested in the language of the Harlem Renaissance and doing research in, and then writing up your research in that specific language. And I think that's a good example of where you can say, well, it's all English. These are actually, right, these are very different types of language, even if we might call them dialects. All right, we're gonna be very fluid with our use of language here. Sapir was another of Boas's students. And what's interesting is Sapir, Whorf, if anybody's interested, Whorf was actually an insurance adjuster who took some classes with Sapir at Yale. They never published together, and there is no hypothesis. What Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, though, refers to is a series of debates started in the mid-20th century, having to do with the impact of language on thought, okay? And this goes back to some early Sapir and really Boasian thinking. Sapir is famous for having this line that the language we think has a tyrannical hold on the way we see the world. All right, and there's power there. And I want to just say that Sapir was talking about language and power before people even realized he was talking about language and power. The reason Sapir's teachings often get taken off into left field is because of Whorf. And it's worth just pointing out what Whorf did was he took this idea and he drew on the idea of the Hopi from the Southwest. And he said, the Hopi, they don't have morphemes on their verbs for future tense and past tense. And maybe that's a reason why the Hopi are living in poverty. Maybe it's because they don't understand progression. They don't understand progress. They don't understand time, right? And so it's their language that's holding their back, not the fact that they were, colonized by the American government. No, it must be their language. And that created a bit of an uproar. A lot of people disagreed with this and pointed out the obvious problems with Whorf's theories. And some of this, unfortunately, got stuck on Sapir. But those were really interesting debates. And I'll just say there's two ways that people have dealt with this since the mid-20th century. Many psychologists and developmental psychologists, I'd highlight John Lucy from the University of Chicago as one of the best. They have taken experimental approaches to look at how language and thought interact. And you can actually do some really neat experiments. John Lucy worked with Yucatec Mayan, where you're actually looking at certain languages that don't have certain complexity, but do they have complexity elsewhere? And then can you do actual controlled experimental studies to show that two people who speak two languages will actually behave somewhat differently, will answer questions somewhat differently. And they can find a connection. But the big takeaway is that these are all very minor things, very, very minor things. It's not what we would really call a tyrannical hold. And most importantly, just because you may not have a word for something in your language doesn't mean that you can't learn that concept. You can't have it described to you and you can't get it. I do this with kids in Florida all the time. I say, who hasn't seen snow before? Half the class has never seen snow before, but I can explain to them 15 different types of snow that you find up north. They don't have to have actually experienced it. They don't have to know what the difference is between powder, slush, and sleet and snowball snow. You can explain this stuff. And that's, the thing is it doesn't really have a tyrannical hold. This is how we learn to communicate. Okay, now the other direction that many linguistic anthropologists have taken, and this is where I want to go with the rest of this talk, is to talk about language and power. And to really build on some of the early ideas that Sapir and others were trying to make, which is that the language you speak has a real power on your life, on where you're headed, but also all of what we do, especially if you're a teacher, is linguistically mediated, right? We are teaching and we are learning through language. Obviously, language, knowledge, and power, right, have very, very close connections. The one other person that I want to use here to transition quickly is Noam Chomsky, and another person many people would say, really, you're going to put language and power next to Noam Chomsky? Because he's often known as somebody who avoided in his early career discussions of these kinds of things. But I do want to come back and say, so without overwhelming people, a lot of Chomsky's impact, and the reason he's often called the father of modern American linguistics, is that he developed these ideas of universal grammar and the nativist approach, the idea that we're all born with language. And that in some ways, irked some folks in the nurture camp in the 70s and 80s. And many linguistic anthropologists critiqued Chomsky, and a lot of these critiques have come from within linguistics. The reason I'm saying this, though, is when Chomsky started doing his work in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, the reason he took this universalist approach is because he was essentially an anti-racist. I mean, he was speaking back to a lot of the folks at the time who were arguing that there were certain types of language in the US that were degenerate, that were not as good, that were not as complicated, they hadn't fully developed. And again, the point here is that if language is something that is born, that we are born with innately, and I know that there are some complexities there, but his point is, you can't just say that, hey, because this person is speaking a degenerate language, they somehow are a degenerate person, or that their brain has not developed to the same level. And this is the kind of stuff that was being said in the 1960s. So again, getting back to this idea that language is a product of the human brain, right? That we speak human language was in fact, an anti-racist statement that was really powerful at the time. Even though I think the key difference is that Chomsky was defining language very differently than how we define language in linguistic anthropology. Okay, I just wanted to point that out. Where you really see an impact on modern day, what I would say, current linguistic anthropology, and the focus of linguistic anthropology since the 90s on power and language and power, is when you look at the impact of language on gender, language and gender, or the discussion of language and gender. And so I'm going to run back here real quick. So coming out of the 60s and 70s, if some of you may be familiar with Robin Lakoff, and Robin Lakoff's work from the 1970s was very influential and very important. Some of you may have heard of assertiveness training for women in the workforce, and this comes out of Lakoff's work from the 70s. Lakoff didn't call this female deficit theory, but it's often referred to as female deficit theory because here's the idea. So there was a lot of research in the 50s and 60s that was done by linguists. And what they did is they sat down with normal Americans, which meant they picked white middle-class suburban couples. And they sat down with them in experimental settings and said, please talk. And when they recorded this language, they realized, wow, Americans, or they didn't say that, they said men and women speak really differently. What they didn't say was white suburban men and women in the 50s and 60s speak differently. But they said, wow, men and women speak so differently. Men are so rude and loud, and they talk over you, and they interrupt, and they're competitive. And women are just so quiet and passive, and they're cooperative, and they never say anything mean, and they're not vulgar. And the idea was, boy, this must be something in our genetics, right? Men just must be aggressive, powerful people, and women must just be, these cooperative, nurturing, passive people. And so this caused, right? This is one of these great problems of people's own construction. It caused this great problem where it was like, well, how are women going to enter the workforce? 60s and 70s corporate America, it's this hostile linguistic environment for women. And so the argument here that people like Lakoff made was that the language difference between men and women in the workforce and in the workplace is a product of natural inherent power differences between men and women, right? Men are simply more powerful. they're the dominant sex, and therefore, right, women need assertiveness training because they're just not on that level. So if women want to compete in that sort of Mad Men atmosphere of corporate America, they need to be given training to be more assertive and to keep up. Okay, very big impact that has then in the 1970s and through the 1980s. The anthropologists start getting into it in 1982, 1984, where you see Maltz and Borker. And some of you may not be familiar with Maltz and Borker, classics from the early 80s. But what they did is they developed this dual cultures model where they critiqued Lakoff in particular and said, okay, we know from anthropology this idea that men are just naturally dominant to women, that's just wrong, right? That's just false. In fact, while it's true, you can go to any culture in the world and say, do men and women speak differently? And people will say, yeah, they do. When you ask, how do men speak or how do women speak? What they will tell you is very different, right? In some cultures, they will say, women are really loud and really vulgar. And in others, they'll say, well, men are really loud and really vulgar, right? It depends on the culture. And so for Maltz and Borker, what was interesting is they said, okay, what's going on here in the workforce is not really a power issue. The problem is we have two different cultures of language, okay? We have boy language, okay? And we have girl language. And girls grow up in these girl cultures and they play with girls and they play girl games. And then they develop a culture that's not really natural, but it's this, sort of girl language. And then they bring that to this, the classroom, they bring it to the office. And then they bump into boy culture and boy language that develops from boy games and boy things. And so in other words, what's interesting about this is it's not really actually about power for Maltz and Borker, it's about culture. Gender cultures. And they actually, in their model, they draw on methods for resolving conflict between ethnic groups that speak different language. And they basically say, this is the same kind of thing we're doing. Now, this has a huge impact. The big people this impacts in the 1990s are John Gray, PhD. He always puts a PhD after his name. He wrote Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And the other is Deb Tannen. These are both kind of pseudo-academics. Deb Tannen always gets cited by anthropologists for some reason as the only person they can think of. But Deb Tannen's not really a self-help academic. And these are both self-help academics. And what they do is they take Maltz and Borker's idea and they say, aha, let's apply this to America. Where you really want to see this, go watch White Men Can't Jump. Rosie Perez's character is really into this stuff and is always trying to explain it back to Woody Harrelson in that movie. But the idea here is that women just have to understand men. And if you can understand men and men's culture, then you'll understand why men talk the way they talk. And you'll just let them go and forgive them. And men at the same time just have to realize, look, this is how women are. This is women's culture. Women talk this way, and that's just the way they are. And we just have to let them, do this. And most of these self-help books you might understand are actually marketed to women, right, who are upset with how their husband speaks. And this is about, hey, you just have to understand that this is about culture. This is boys' culture. Okay. Now, where does this go? You can imagine that by the 1990s, many linguistic anthropologists are calling BS on a lot of this. And I'm going to point to Deborah Cameron in particular as my favorite. She has a great book called The Myth of Mars and Venus, but there are many others that you can point to who basically say, okay, look, Lakoff was absolutely right. This is about power. The problem was this was not inherent power. This isn't power that we're born with that makes men more powerful than women. However, in 1950s America, right, men had a lot more power than women, and that's why we're seeing these differences in language. However, instead of going at this as, oh, women need more assertiveness, right? Maybe the problem was that men were being a little bit over the top with their empowerment, okay? At the same time, they would look at Maltz and Borker and say, okay, yeah, these are cultural issues, but you can't just start giving people self-help about this and make it seem like, oh, boys will just be boys, right? And that's one of the big takeaways here, right? There are legitimate power issues taking place here, right? And by just saying, oh, this is just a cultural difference, we're ignoring the power, okay? And so the key here with Deborah Cameron is to say, look, this is about power, but this is about culturally constructed power. And we need to look at that power. This is an inherent power. And in fact, you can find cultural examples. Some of my favorite are Don Kulik's examples from New Guinea, where you can find cultures where men are very passive and very quiet and women are extremely vulgar and extremely loud. And that's rooted in cultural ideologies about gender. And so the big takeaway that we get here from linguistic anthropology and gender and power, okay, is the kind of gendered language ideologies, the kind of ideas about gender that we find in language are a reflection of power in society. That makes sense? I mean, and then you can take that and you can run that further. So we have lots of stereotypes in the United States about how people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds speak and talk. And the idea here would be, that's a reflection not of language, but that's a reflection of their power in society and their place within society. Okay, so those are some of the basics then on language and power. Okay, you often will hear this called language politics. And so people will say, oh, linguistic anthropologists today, they study language politics. They study this other jargony thing now that I've mentioned, language ideologies. But these are really simple things. Language and thought, language and knowledge, we can't really think without language. We probably all think in different languages depending on what we're thinking about. Politics, we often don't define like political scientists, government decision-making. Politics is really about power. So if you're looking at, language politics, we're talking about knowledge, power complexes. And we've probably run into these before. A lot of this comes out of linguistic anthropology. You might just cite Foucault, but you've always got people like Mikhail Bakhtin in the early 20th century from Russia and people like Sapir who really were talking about these things early on. I'd even point back to Walter Benjamin, one of the most important academics to work on media back in the 1920s and 30s, was really actually concerned with how the fascists in Germany were using media at the time to push a certain type of ideology and a certain type of language. And so they were talking about language and power early in the 20th century. It's quite fascinating, especially around the times of fascism. Okay, so language and politics. A couple things I just want to mention. Okay, we're probably familiar with the power of naming. Okay, that's linguistic. And this is maybe the simplest example that you can come up with, again, of the power of just simply language, especially in the colonial era, especially if we're going to talk about indigenous communities. I worked in Africa. Africa, a lot of people don't realize, is the continent that has most of the world's linguistic diversity. There are more languages in Africa than in any other continent. And that's because of another thing people don't know about Africa is that it was colonized last. It was the last of the major continents to be colonized. And it's one of the reasons it retains so much linguistic diversity. However, that's often a real surprise to people. People often don't know how big Africa is, right? This is part of that the erasure that took place through colonial history. I know I'm dropping a couple of names here, but another one, and I'm sure I can attach a little bibliography to this, but Mary Louise Pratt, if anybody's familiar with Mary Louise Pratt, one of my favorite books, Imperial Eyes from 1992, she talks all about this process of seeing, right, naming, mapping, and then you can erase, then you can take, right, then you can extract, which is what much of this was about. And so when you look at something like, and I'll get back to language ideologies in a second, but if you look at something like, Colonialism 101, this is language, right? There's language, there's literally English language written on here, but the lines have been drawn in a way that is fundamentally about empowering and disempowering groups of people. But the other important line on this map, if anybody's familiar with the classic colonial map, the Mercator map, a good reminder that colonialism is still ongoing, that we use this map at all. But right, there's your equator, right? So what I would argue this is a fundamentally racist map. What it's doing is it's reproducing really, really powerful racial distinctions and disparities by shrinking the southern part of the globe, right, and putting all the focus on the north. And we live with this, we deal with this. The absurdity of Greenland somehow being bigger than South America or Africa on this map, right? However, and I'm gonna get to this point, this is the optimism from all of this, is that we can also counter map, right? There are other ways that we can map things. Many of you have probably seen the Gall-Peters projection, which just gives you a look at the world if all of the land masses were in the proper relation in terms of size, right? And what you see suddenly, and this always, it's funny, I show this to students and they're like, what's wrong with this map, right? There's a literacy here that they didn't know that they had, a visual literacy for the map. And all of a sudden this really sort of shocks them, right? Now I use the map that doesn't have names and doesn't have lines written on it, which is also, you could say, erasing the people that could be all over these maps. But there's a lot that we can do with maps, just in terms of shifting the equator to be in the middle. So you can play with this a lot. I used to always, I mentioned Africa, when I would come back from research in Africa, I'd often have people say things like, what do they speak? Do they speak African? Did you learn African? The number of people, educated people who asked me that was quite shocking. It's like, well, actually they have more languages than anywhere else. And so you can see this is about language, but this is also about geography. This is about different types of symbolism. And again, it's about our mind. It's about how we think about things. And some of you may have seen these maps, but again, this is a type of visual language that's used, right? And what really is a meme, okay? To educate and to teach. Okay, so keep moving. I want to get back really quickly to language ideologies. Language ideologies, I'm going to run through this really quickly because I want everybody who thinks language ideologies is a jargony term to realize it's a very simple one. It means ideas about language. And Boas actually talked about this, folk ideas. He called them folk typologies of language. And Boas thought they were useless. They weren't really that important. Who cares what people think about language? It was really Michael Silverstein, late 1970s, who started to return to this. And that's because when we think of language change, generally, linguists will take the approach of genetic linguistics. And you may have heard of genetic linguistics before. It's where you compare different languages and then try to reconstruct how humans move through space and time. And it's not unlike doing the mathematical work on comparisons of human DNA structure. Okay, you're looking at certain relationships and you're understanding that certain things like genetics, but also linguistics change naturally through time. Silverstein in the 70s said, yeah, except that that's not how language actually changes, is it? Language changes because there's a new pop song, or language changes because something's just not cool. Language changes because somebody gives a speech on TV and everybody sees it and they start doing it, right? How do we understand this, right? How do you understand a colonial power like France going into West Africa and making people stop speaking their language and learn French? That's not, right? That's not a natural, slow process. That's a process that's based on language ideologies. Okay, so ideas about language, saying that this is a good language or this is a bad language. This is a cool language. This is a low status language. This is a regressive language, whereas this is a language of resistance. All right, these are the ideas. This is what we mean here with language ideologies. And then this plays out on the interpersonal level. And this is where I wanted to try to bring this back to make this useful in the sense that it's really not that abstract. This is probably the least abstract thing I can think of in all of anthropological theory. Okay, so we deal with this every day, and it's always intersectional. So I want to come back to race and ethnicity here. I talked about gender, but honestly, I don't know that you can talk about gender without talking about race, or vice versa. You know, you talk about women, it's like, are you talking about old women, young women, white women, black women, Hispanic women? Like what women, right? Women are never just women, just like people of a certain race are never just people of a certain race. So we have to look at these things and how they intersect. But to just talk about race, because everyone in this department, our anthropology department is probably an expert on this, but we do know, we talk about this a lot, right? Race is a biological myth, it's a cultural construct, it's a social reality. And I recommend everyone take Dr. Madrigal's class so that you can discuss gravelly and more reading on how race can become, right, a biological reality, especially for certain medical issues. What I want to say here from linguistic anthropology is, okay, it's also a linguistic reality. And when we think especially about the social construction and the social reality side to race, right? People often say, if it's a social construct, can't we just deconstruct it? And then people will say, but no, we always see race, right? We can't just pretend it doesn't exist. What we often miss is the way that we reproduce race and the way that we can also deconstruct race. The way that racial structures and ethnic structures and power structures like this change is often through language. It's reproduced through language, and it's also resisted through language. And that's what you get from a lot of this linguistic anthropology. And I'm going to try to give you some more examples here. Attitudes, right? So language ideologies. Language ideologies are rooted very much in attitude. When people speak, they speak with attitude, okay? If there's one thing, actually, I should have said this before. A simple definition of language for a linguistic anthropologist is taking social action. Right? Now that's an interesting definition, another sort of, you'd almost say a cop-out definition, but language is taking social action. But yes, that's what a linguistic anthropologist would say, because our language is never neutral. It always has attitude, right? We can pretend that there is not any power involved in the language we use, but that's nonsense, right? It's like pretending that we don't see race, right? Language is never just neutral. There's always power at play, and we have to be aware of these things, right? So language ideologies, always rooted in power. Which language are you speaking? What accent are you speaking in? How might people understand the way that you are using language, even as simple as the font that you're using on your PowerPoint presentation, right, is saying something, right? Or that at least somebody can interpret. Okay, so attitudes. The other part of this, right? Look at multilingual situations. Language ideologies are always there in multilingual situations where you're choosing which language do we speak, which is the high status language. When I talk to this person, which is the most appropriate language to speak for them? If I speak the wrong language in the wrong way, might I offend someone? What this is really about, all right, is about attitudes about language and power dynamics associated with how we think about language in society. And you can go through a lot of these. Obviously, language ideologies are rooted in speech communities. I can give you some really great work. Marcelina Morgan has done a lot of work on hip hop speech communities, international hip hop speech communities. Even when people don't speak the same language, like French versus English versus Spanish, they can still get together and participate in the same speech community, right? Which is an attitudinal community. It's quite interesting. So these are fundamentally about identity. They're fundamentally about performance. And then the last little example I'll give, if anybody really wants to look up Jane Hill, Jane Hill's work on mock Spanish is fantastic. Mock Spanish, profanity, comedy are often really fair game, as are our memes when you're talking about linguistic anthropology, because it's often through these types of language that we're playing with power, okay? And so mock language in particular can appear at times, like, you're mocking someone. The question is, are you actually resisting a power structure or are you reproducing a power structure? And sometimes, and if you read Jane Hill, you're doing both at the same time. And it's this awareness that we need to develop a bit more. In other words, what are the actual impacts of the words that we say, not just on the people that we're speaking to, but on the larger social structures in society, okay? Now, I'm gonna run through just a couple of real quick questions as I wind this up, just things that I like to leave, especially students with when we're talking about language and power. But specifically, how is your own use of power reproducing or resisting structures? And we're all doing this. It's sort of false to pretend that we're not, right? It's about learning and being aware of how our language, especially the language that we use, let's say, in front of a big audience, might have impacts that we're not even aware of, right? And that's I think really important to just think about. These types of stereotypes, a lot of people would say linguistic and language ideologies. Okay, they're just stereotypes. Okay, great. Let's call language ideologies stereotypes. How are we reproducing or resisting stereotypes around language? We need to be careful about that because language is heavily, heavily stereotyped. And then the last one is one that I think a lot about. How are we potentially using privilege and actually reproducing our privilege by using language that only we can use? And this is something Jane Hill talks about. A lot of people who do mock language, right, don't realize that, okay, it's funny, but you're doing something that not everybody can do. You're only doing that because it's your privilege to be able to do that. And so that's something to think about, okay? Now, I just wanted to leave this, and I don't know, I couldn't not mention this because I think we have mostly faculty and students watching, but you see this all the time in the classroom, right? This is a daily thing happening in the classroom, and you don't have to be a teacher to be aware of this. You can be a student who sees this happen, right? You can be a really good ally to a friend in the classroom who you may be aware, right, that something just happened, but it's like, right? Think about how language is doing a lot, right? Language is doing a lot at once. I wanted to mention, you see this in the classroom all the time around gender. I've spoken to so many students who are women who say that they wish that they went to an all-women's school so that men wouldn't speak over them in the classroom. This is one of the oldest things I've heard all the time. As faculty, I think people are often aware of this, but I think as students, it's also important to be aware of these things that we're bringing in, right? These are cultural power issues that we should be resisting, right? We shouldn't be continuing. And it doesn't mean, gaslighting somebody. It means just saying, hey, let's figure out how the words, that we use, the way that we speak, the pauses that we leave. I always have trouble with my pauses, right? Slow down, let other people speak, be aware of the fact that not everybody has the same privilege or feels empowered to use language as everyone else. Okay, I also wanted to mention this in the classroom because there's a lot of language in the classroom that's not spoken. And classrooms are one of the greatest places to look at all of the unspoken language that's taking place that shows that, again, language is not so much mouth stuff, but brain stuff, because we understand, right? Of course, faculty understand what student body language looks like, okay? But also there's dress, there's how you dress, there's how you cut your hair, for those of you who have the privilege of being able to cut your hair, right? You're making a lot of choices that have impacts, that have ripple effects, right? With how society changes. I could, go through additional examples of these, how they intersect with race, how they intersect with sexuality, how they intersect with ethnicity. I want to bring this back to intersectionality because in linguistic anthropology, we have the tools for this, right? How to understand, for example, what we would call direct and indirect indexicality, not to confuse anybody, but in other words, how the words that you use are having lots of direct and indirect impacts on a lot of the structures in society, specifically power structures. Okay, so really quickly to wind this up, I want to get back to our main theme of the year. Our main theme, I'm going to go with our chair and say our main theme this year is actually making good trouble. This is how we can actually use language, I think. So on the one hand, while some of this, I guess you could say, is like a warning, and it's like saying that, language can be something that can reproduce power, right? It can reproduce privilege. We have to be very careful of it. At the same time, I think, language is what's really going to be useful for all of us in terms of remapping and rewriting history, and in a sense, making sure that certain communities are represented well, and that we are resisting power structures, let's say, as opposed to reproducing them. Okay? With that, I'll wind it up. So thank you very much. And I actually could, are there any questions, comments that I could reply to real quick? I appreciate everybody who was here on a Monday afternoon. All right, excellent. There seemed to be some chat happening. We'll be able, for those of you who are here, we're going to be able to take this and record this and post pieces of it to our YouTube site. I could even re-record places that are not clear. And so much appreciation again for everybody being here. Special thanks to Sarah Taylor and to Will Lucas in particular for helping with the back end part of this. And we do hope that this will be improving with time. We are always looking for improvement. So thanks very much.